let's talk about what Inktense pencils are. Well, if you are struggling with watercolour paint, then these could be the ideal medium for you. By applying them onto the watercolour paper like this and activating the ink with water, you can achieve really bold colours as well as subtle soft tones by just blending in the colours with your brush like this, and even just using a diluted form and applying it to the paper like this so you can get your really soft subtle tones. You can see by the 3 circles that I've swatched out here the really soft delicate tone that you can achieve, the mid-tones which I'm now layering my colours onto when dry, and of course that really dark circle on the bottom where I've applied the water to the paper, and then just applying the pencil onto the damp paper like this, you can achieve the brightest, darkest tone possible. They're very buildable, they won't lift off, so if you're struggling with watercolour, then give these a go. Now I've attached my paper to my watercolour board like this, and I've traced on a really simple outline from my photograph by just scribbling on the back and tracing it down this way. If you want to draw freehand, you can of course, but we do provide you with a free trace down and reference photograph. These are the colours that I've swatched out today, and I'm using just a few colours from my Inktense pencil set here. And the little palette that I'm going to be using is from Etcher. It has 2 separate compartments like this which have plenty of wells that you can mix your colours up, and of course they don't stain. Selection of brushes here, clean glass of water, some kitchen paper, and we are good to go. I'm using mixed media paper for this tutorial simply because it does make the blending process a whole lot easier. And remember, it's all about building up your colours slowly, very similar to the way that you would use watercolour. Now, there are a few ways that you can use Inktense, and you can see me here scribbling these colours onto the card and picking up the colour like this. I have a mixture of amber and also violet, and I'm just applying this in a really watery consistency to the lightest areas within the bluebells. These bluebells were a photograph that I had taken recently while I was out on a trip to the Gower Peninsula, and I saw them in a wood and they were almost dancing in the wind, which is why I've taken this photograph and felt they would be a really beautiful tutorial to paint. These Inktense pencils can be a really great way of starting out. It means that they don't lift off in the way that watercolour can once they are dry. There are so many different ways that you can use them, and they really are a versatile medium. But as with watercolour, we are working from light to dark in the way that I'm doing here. So this kind of grey tone represents the lightest areas within the bluebells. So I'm just applying this with my number 4 size brush right onto the paper, wet on dry. You can see this time by using my, this is a pencil, this is a violet colour, and I'm using it lightly onto the mixed media paper directly, and then I'm mixing in deep violet on the outside edge here. Notice how I'm using a really light touch to apply the pencil. This means that it doesn't mark the paper or cause any indentations. Once I've applied the pencil to the paper, I use my brush to activate the ink and blend it through like this. I have a tiny puddle of water in the middle of my palette, which I'm using to clean my brush, patting it onto the kitchen paper and then blending it through. I do use this application method for applying watercolour, and I have done a separate video on this. If you'd like to watch it, I'll attach it to the top of your screen so that you can click through after this video to have a more in-depth idea on how I apply watercolour. Notice how I'm applying the residual paint on my brush and dragging it down this particular petal. This is the blue tone that I've selected. Now, of course, if you don't have these colours, you can use watercolour or indeed any other Inktense pencils that you have that are similar in colour and tone. This is deep violet being applied after the blue tone. The blue is called Lagoon, and I'm just using that really light touch to apply this colour where I feel that particular shade is needed. I've kept the reference photograph in screen because you've asked me to do that, and I'm just using the reference photograph as a guide. You can see that I've added an additional stem to the base of this because it was kind of floating in midair. You can see that by adding the water to these pencils, you activate the ink to bring out these really strong, vibrant tones. This is a number 4 size synthetic brush. And as I said at the start, all of the materials that I'm using today, I will link in the description box underneath this video. Continuing the process by picking up the paint, this time from my paper that I've swatched out here. So once I've scribbled the paint onto the watercolour paper for the swatch card, I'm using my brush damp to lift that paint off and paint it onto the paper just in the way that I would paint watercolour paint, in a similar way to the way I would use a pan paint. And I'm going to do the same on the other petals here. Now I've kept some of them blank. This is just a repeat of what I'm doing. So you can see the colour I've just picked up. That's the deep violet. And then working around the deep violet right up to that pencil line with the lagoon. It's all about building up your colours carefully to stop them from going muddy. Now it shouldn't happen so much with these pencils because they are ink and not watercolour, and once that ink is dry it's very difficult for it to lift off. But the secret is slow application, carefully observing your photograph and just building up your colours slowly. With that damp brush you can see how I'm blending the paint, or the ink rather, into the mixed media paper, and again using my swatch card to pick up that dry pencil line and again applying it in smaller layers to get this really soft natural effect. Cleaning my brush and my puddle and blending it through. Make sure that you pat your brush dry onto your kitchen paper. This stops your paint from flooding. Again, picking up the paint from the dry pencil and applying it like this. I'll continue this process on all of the other petals. These are our base tones and they are tones that will be built upon later. I've applied the pencil this time onto the damp paint. Notice by doing this, the strength of the ink is much more intense, but take care. If you apply your paint onto damp paper, it doesn't blend so easily. So this needs to be a really definite move, and you would apply this way only if you're absolutely certain that you want your colour to go there. The wetter your paper, the stronger and more intense the paint application. So you can see the colours that I'm picking up here. This is the deep violet in a really light colour, just by picking it up from the swatch card. And we have violet going on next, and I'm dropping this into the damp paper similar to the way you would use wet in wet with watercolour painting. So this is the blue tone, this is lagoon, and going around the outside with deep violet. Very gentle stroke with a pencil, and then just activating that pencil with my number 4 size round. Cleaning my brush, patting it dry and blending it through. Now at the beginning of this tutorial I mentioned that we have a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, indeed all of our tutorials here on YouTube, and there are a couple of ways that you can access these. First of all, you can join our Facebook group, and I will link it in the description box underneath this video. By joining our Facebook group, you can have access to all of our line drawings and reference photographs to our tutorials here on YouTube. And of course, you can paint your paintings along with us and post your finished paintings on our Facebook group for feedback from me and our other fantastic members. But don't worry if you're not on Facebook, I will also put the line drawing and reference photograph right at the end of this video so that you can screenshot them and print them out yourself. I'm using a plain water glaze now to unify all the washes that I've done. This will just help merge the colours together gently, and then you have to let it dry. I've completed the process on all of the other ones like this, and I'm now using a really light mix of deep violet just to add the initial wash on some of the elements here. And now we have the light olive and the violet colours here. And I'm applying light olive to the stem like this, and I'm going to be applying the violet colour to the other side of the stem. You can see at this point the different tonal values in this pretty floral piece. It's not just about your colours, it's also about the tonal variations that make your paintings have that little bit more something special, I think. Always start off by working light to dark and building up your colours like this. This is still the light olive green colour that I'm using, and as I said, I'm applying the violet tone to the outside and using my number 0 size brush this time. This is by Tintoretto, again another synthetic brush which has a really fine point, activating that paint and working through like this. Now, if you are enjoying this painting tutorial and enjoy painting florals, just to let you know that we do have a Patreon, let me tell you a little bit about it. I just want to take a moment to tell you about our Patreon, which at the time of filming has 4 different membership levels, from mini weekly videos of doodles, vlogs and podcasts to full-length botanical painting tutorials, which are exclusive to Patreon and are of course ad-free. If this is something that interests you, I've put a link in the description below, plus it's a way for you to support my channel. So if that's something that interests you, I'll link it in the description box underneath and you can take a look yourself. If you are on Instagram, do follow us there. We are at The Wonders of Watercolour, where we try to post daily. You can have tips and tricks, behind the scenes stuff, as well as fun reels and all that kind of thing. So do follow us on Instagram at The Wonders of Watercolour, and again, I will link it in the description box underneath this video. Now, we have done quite a few Inktense tutorials here on YouTube. In fact, we have a playlist, just a small playlist at the moment, but I will put it right at the end of this video along with the line drawing and reference photographs. So if this is something that interests you and you want to learn more about Inktense, click through and I'll see you there. So continuing to build up the colours like this. Now, there are a few ways that you can apply Inktense. You can use the pencils directly onto the paper like this, or you can use them on the swatch cards or wet on wet and wet on dry. They are so versatile, and once they are dry, they are permanent. So if you have trouble building up your watercolours, this is such a good medium to start building up your confidence with. So they are such a great confidence booster. So you can start to really build up your layers and get the depth of colour that maybe you had trouble with watercolour. I find that Inktense pencils work better on mixed media paper. Now, whether that's just me and my application method, I don't know, and we all have our favourite papers to work on, but because this is kind of like a semi-smooth paper, I find that it makes the blending really, really easy. The colours that I'm using here are deep violet and light oak, and again I'm blending them through. I have got a tiny bit of amber, which is the yellow colour that I've chosen to use, but again, don't worry too much if you haven't got these colours. Use any purples, greens and yellows that you have. Once this is dry, I'm going over again with a light olive colour just to enhance the depth of colour that I felt that I needed, and once again using deep violet to go over some of the darker, more purpley tones that I see within the stem. We're not looking for photorealism here, it's just about having fun, creating paintings that can boost your confidence and you can have something that you can be proud of. And remember, it's all about practice and making sure that it's something that you feel comfortable with. using the tip of my number 0 brush to blend it through to the end. Now that everything's dry, I'm just enhancing the colours on this little bud here by using the same colours that I used at the beginning, which are Lagoon and Deep Violet. You'll notice that I've left a lighter area within the middle where there was a highlight on the little bud. Try to avoid that highlight if you can. It just gives it that more three-dimensional look. Using the tip of my brush to kind of wiggle that ink into place and creating that really soft edge as I work through, and sharpening up that outside edge as I work along. Everything is now dry, so I'm mixing amber, and you can see how I'm picking it up from the swatch card here and applying it using my number 0 brush, wet on dry. And if you look at the reference photograph, you'll see that there are kind of a few rusty areas on the petals of this particular flower head. This is bark. This is a kind of dark browny purpley tone, and I'm using it off my swatch card. So I swatched the pencil onto the watercolour paper there and picking it up as before. Now I'm using bark here to darken up the purple area. You don't necessarily have to use your purple to darken it up. This gives the illusion of that purple being really strong. You can, of course, use your purple colour if you want to. Picking up the dark bark colour from my palette, you can see how I'm negatively painting around the stamen and anther of this flower head here, using the very tip of my brush. And I'm still using the bark just to apply a little bit of shading on the outside edge of this petal. Everything's dry, going back to violet, and I'm applying it where I feel I need to add some darker values to the heads of the bluebells like this. Remember that pencil will stick, so make sure that everything is dry at this point. So you see me here mixing light olive and violet together to create this kind of yellowy, greeny, purpley tone. You could use olive or the yellow tone to do this. It doesn't really matter, but you want it to look different from the purple colour. This is the violet colour that you can see here. And the paint that is left on my brush, I'm just using it to create a little bit of a vein in the middle of this petal here. So just softening out that edge and blending through that ink like this. Notice how vibrant these colours are at this point. I think you would struggle to get this depth of colour with watercolour. So just working around the lighter areas like this, and just using the tip of that soft brush to blend the colours together. Keeping an eye on your reference photograph as you work through, and it's better to work on small areas at a time. There's no rush with this painting, it's completely stress-free using our Learn to Paint as you paint approach. Picking up some of the Lagoon, which is that soft blue, and creating a vein down the middle of this flower head. I'm just mixing up a tiny puddle of bark and Lagoon here, this time into my palette, to create a shadow underneath this tiny little fold on the petals. Just gives it a little bit more interest and adds some tonal variation. I'm showing you here quite a few ways to use the Inktense pencils, and it's up to you whether you want to use them whichever way you want to. We all have our sort of different ways of using things, and it can be, maybe you just prefer to use them directly onto the paper as I'm doing here. I know that sometimes it can be easier to swatch them onto the card first and pick up the paint that way. So this is bark again to enhance the darker values on the outside areas of these petals. But as I said, it's whatever works best for you, and you'll need to play around with them a little bit to see which method of application you prefer. Or of course you can use all methods of application as and when you feel you want to. Remember, we are creating art, and art should be fun. So this is bark, and again deep violet, and activating it as usual. By swatching your colours onto your watercolour card, it does mean that you can create a really soft, subtle effect with your Inktense pencils. I think if you want a stronger method of application, you would be better off by applying it in the way that I showed you earlier on. But like I said, it's whatever works for you. We all have our own ways of doing things, so whatever makes you feel comfortable. But just so you know, the stronger colour will be achieved by applying your pencil straight onto the watercolour paper, and a more subtle effect by swatching it onto your spare piece of paper and picking it up that way. Keep in mind that if you activate your Inktense pencils on your swatch paper, you won't be able to pick up the colour. It's only when you scribble your pencil without activating it that you can do that. So if you activate your ink first, you won't be able to pick it up because it does dry permanently. So if you're going to do the swatch card method, make sure that you pick up from the dry pencil marks and not your activated ink, if that makes sense. If you do have any questions or queries, do drop them in the comments below and I'll do my absolute best to help you out. You can see that by applying the two watercolour pencils onto the paper like this, they kind of blend together when you activate them with water, and I really like that effect. Just blending everything through. Working around bit by bit, taking your time. By working in small areas at a time, it means that you can really focus on where you're applying your pigments. Now at the top of this petal here, where it folds over onto the main part of the flower, I felt that was a lot darker, so I'm using the deep violet colour here so that there's a definite separation between that little fold on the upper petal and the body of the flower here. But notice how I'm leaving some gaps. Little highlights make all the difference. Just sharpening up that edge with my brush and taking that pigment around the outside. Deep violet and lagoon again, just putting them where I'm feeling that colour is needed to be enhanced. And just following now the pattern that I put in place. So all the guesswork has gone and we're just enhancing those beautiful tones. So the colours that I'm using here are lagoon and deep violet, with a tiny bit of bark on that outside edge there, just to darken up that purple. You can see here that I've applied the lagoon colour directly onto the damp paint. You'll notice how it's sticking, as I mentioned earlier on. So if you don't want this to happen, you need to avoid applying your pencils to damp paint unless you want this to be a deliberate thing. So we're going in with deep violet over that green colour just to give that a little bit of a boost. Working through on the underside of these, adding deep violet and blending it out. So this is violet that I'm using, and back to deep violet. You can even glaze these over one another, so you could put deep violet, and once it's dry, if you wanted to, you could just give it a boost with violet and vice versa. You don't have to be too strict here. I think the important thing is learning how to apply them and also building up the colours and seeing what tones you can get. The colours that I've selected for this tutorial are pretty interchangeable, and I'll run through them here. They are violet, deep violet, amber, light olive, bark and lagoon, and I did decide to use antique white. If you have got antique white within your kit, I'll show you later on what I did with that. Blending these through, this is deep violet, strengthening up the darker values as I feel I need to, and going back over this part with the light olive with a tiny bit of amber on the outside. Merging them together with that damp brush. Make sure that there isn't too much water on your brush at this point. So this is dry, so we're going back over with deep violet and bark. And just continuing the process with bark here, just to enhance some of the darker values that I feel were needed. You can see how that's really given that purple colour a boost just by adding that colour there. And it's sort of, think of it in the way that you would glaze watercolour, where you would apply one colour over another, and you can do exactly the same thing with Inktense pencils to create the darker values that you need and to really enhance the colours that you've put down to begin with to give your colours a boost. Adding a tiny bit of deep violet here and dropping in the bark. Remember that if you do join our Facebook group, you can post your finished paintings up there and get some feedback from our wonderful members, so do consider joining us. We are an amazing community, and as I said earlier on, you can have access to all of our line drawings and reference photographs for our YouTube tutorials so that you can join in. Not everybody likes the drawing element, so they are all there for you to trace down, and they are all completely free. Now I'm going around the stamen and anther. This is bark to enhance the lighter values, to make the stamen and anther jump off the page, and once again blending them through. And you can see these are so buildable. I'm just adding a tiny bit of amber to some of the yellow elements that you can see there, and because I did lose that little bit of rust that I applied, we're just going over that a little bit, but I'm not too worried. I think I probably would have left it off. Okay, going back and going over with Lagoon once more. And it really is a case at this point of cross-referencing your photograph and seeing if there's anything that you need to darken up or anything that you feel needs blending together. And of course you can use a little bit of artistic license and brighten and darken up some of those areas that you feel necessary. So we have bark going on here. With a little bit of deep violet. And I'm just using a plain water glaze to merge those colours together. And again, just blurring through that bark. If you have Inktense pencils in your kit, and I know that many of you have because you've mentioned it to me over on our Facebook group, give this tutorial a go and let me know how you get on with them. Using bark now to enhance this area here. This is the antique white. You don't have to use this. This is when everything is completely dry. I'm just using it to kind of merge everything together here, and I will go over some of the highlights on this little bud and just use my sort of plain water glaze to soften everything through. Now at this point it's just a case of going over everything, checking everything's in place and merging everything together with a plain water glaze, and just do some final tweaks here and there. I'm going to stop talking and let you watch the rest of this in peace, listening to some music. Remember to stay until the end, where I'm going to put up the line drawing and the reference photograph for you to screenshot, and of course I'll put that playlist so that you can watch it after this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.